Welcome everyone to the Beyond Pearl Harbor program put on by National Park Service and Pacific Historic Parks. My name is Rob Buscher and I'm the film festival curator of the documentary program that is available to watch all weekend long on the Pacific Historic Parks site. And this evening we're very lucky to be joined by two experts on the segregated troop regiments that served during World War II. This conversation is kind of coming about because one of the focuses within the film festival program was to kind of revisit this legacy of the segregated troop regiments through a series of films that were produced by the Office of War Information, as well as some of the newsreels that were contemporary to World War II. In the collection of films and clips that we edited together that are available as part of the festival program, the valor of the soldiers of color who served in the conflict are absolutely undisputed. I do think it's interesting, though, at this moment in our country's national conversation to sort of revisit the complicated legacy of what it means to have had segregated troop regiments. And so I'd like to welcome our two guests this evening. I'd like to introduce Frank Toland from the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site and Gavin Doe from Go for Broke National Education Center. Frank and Gavin, if you'd both like to sort of expand those introductions a little bit, talk about your role at your respective sites.
My name is Frank Toland. I'm the park guide at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. We give tours, introduce the film, do research, things of that nature.
I'm Gavin Doe. I am the archivist at Go for Broke National Education Center. Our archives include over 1,200 interviews with Japanese American veterans of World War II from the 100th, 442nd, and MIS Military Intelligence Service. We also facilitate a lot of research and contribute to documentaries and films and things like that.
Thank you both for that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We had an opportunity to speak last week and kind of plotted out some of the topics that we'll be discussing. Before we kind of delve into the substance of this conversation, though, I was hoping each of you might be able to provide a brief history of service for both the 442nd and then the Tuskegee Airmen. And Frank, on your half, if you could also talk a little bit about the 761st Tank Battalion or other African-American troops.
Sure. Did you want to start or you want me to?
I can go first. So the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service were three segregated Army units in which Japanese Americans were served during World War II. So the context is after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were given 4C status by the military, which was unfit to serve. And then through challenging that in Hawaii, they were able to form these segregated units. The 100th Battalion and 442nd fought in Europe and had notable battles such as rescuing the Lost Battalion, Rome and Anzio, and then breaking the Gothic Line. Whereas in the Pacific Theater, Japanese American linguists served in the Military Intelligence Service. And it is estimated that their contributions through interrogating prisoners, capturing documents, and translating intel helped shorten the war by 2 years and save countless lives. So that's the backdrop of that.
Thanks for that, Gavin.
And with the Tuskegee Airmen, it grew out of pressure from civil rights groups and also from Eleanor Roosevelt, which would be the reason for one of the derisive nicknames of both the Tuskegee Airmen and also for the Black Panther Tank Battalion, the 761st. They were both called Eleanor's niggers. They were considered experimental or mascot units. Originally, they were not expected to fight. That they were more PR type units. But as the war got more serious, let's say, they had to call them up. And there was also some pressure for the Tuskegee Airmen to be called into duty by Eleanor Roosevelt, so they were transferred to North Africa. Now for the Tuskegee Airmen, we're talking about, as far as the ones that served, we're talking about the 99th Fighter Squadron, the 100th, and also the 301st and the 302nd. Eventually, they were put together and run unit called the 332nd Fighter Group. And they were mostly North Africa for the 99th, and for all of them, Sicily and Italy. Their base was in Ramatelli, and they did bomber escorts into German territory, as well as strafing runs on military targets, civilian targets of interest, like bomb factories, tank factories, things of that nature. Now, for the tank battalion, that was also started as a show unit. They were not originally expected to fight, but as the battles got more serious, the 761st was needed, and the General Patton, even though he was not, how can I put this? He was prejudiced. He was a segregationist. He did not believe African Americans could fight or do anything complicated like tanks, or he believed in the War College study, the infamous War College study of 1925, which said that African Americans were cowards, did not have the smarts or the technical know-how to do anything that was like planes or tanks or anything of that sort, or to be airplane mechanics. Anything that required that kind of skill, they thought African Americans could not accomplish. But for the 761st Tank Battalion, once they got there, they were involved in several major battles, a very high casualty rate among them. But they're probably best known for the Battle of the Bulge, for going through the Siegfried Line, and also for freeing one of the concentration camps in Austria.
Thanks for that summary, Frank. Really helps to kind of understand the campaign that they were both respective combat teams were a part of. I think, one of the things that you both sort of address in some of your introductory remarks are the civil rights component, that there were groups that were advocating so that both African Americans and Japanese Americans would be able to serve in the military. We'll touch on the Japanese American story a little bit later with regards to the voluntary service out of camp. But Frank, maybe we can talk a little bit more about what the African American perspectives on military service were like at that time. Obviously, given the mass inequity that was experienced in society at that time, I think one of the phrases that you had referenced was the idea of a double victory.
Yes, when Pearl Harbor happened, there was a great deal of ambivalence about whether we should even get involved because of things like segregation and, of course, lynchings. At this period of time in America, lynchings was quite commonplace, and not just in the South, but in places in the North as well. And of course, Red Summer had only been maybe 20 years ago. So there was a lot of ambivalence because so many African Americans had volunteered for World War I and had been sent, most of them except for one unit which fought for the French. They had mostly been doing grave digging or ditch digging or service type jobs, or those who served in, say, the Navy or things of that sort were like glorified mess attendants. And so there was pressure that if we were going to serve, that we would actually serve an actual war combat type roles and not just be glorified maids and butlers, basically. But yes, the double victory, James G. Thompson had written, I think in January, he wrote a letter, January of 42, he wrote a letter to the leading paper among African Americans at that time, the leading weekly paper was the Pittsburgh Courier, and it had one of the largest circulations. And he wrote a paper saying, should I risk my life to live half American? Basically setting out that if he wanted to protect the country from the threat from Germany and Japan, but he was also interested in changes here at home, that if he was going to risk his life, he didn't want to come back to the conditions being as bad or worse as they were at present. And that's something that took off within the African American community. And it's something definitely that the 761st and the 332nd believed in, as well as African Americans who served in the military at that point. But it took off within the African American community writ large. You had double V beauty pageants, you had a double V song, a jazz song, double V hairstyles, all sorts of things. It really took off in popularity, and was one of the reasons why you were able to get some of these African Americans to serve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, just knowing some of the history about what the home front campaigns looked like as far as building up the support for the war, as well as even beyond military service, how much the civilian population of the United States was asked to give at that time. And I think, this kind of segues a little bit into the experience of the Japanese Americans. For the historical context, I think most people are probably aware who are watching this, but Japanese Americans living in the West Coast of the United States were mass incarcerated during World War II. About 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry were forcibly evicted and removed into the interior of the country. And this is actually where many of the volunteers came from, who did ultimately serve in the 442nd. But Gavin, I'm wondering if you could give us a little context on how did first the 100th Battalion come to be, and what did that look like then between the viewpoints of Hawaiian and mainland Japanese Americans?
Definitely. The origins of the 100th and 442nd, they really start in Hawaii, the territory of Hawaii at that time. The 100th was a group of enlisted territorial guards or national guards from Hawaii who were disbanded from their units and segregated and put together, and they had no idea what they would be going, what they would be doing. They were just a loose, separate battalion, and they were sent to Wisconsin to train on the mainland. And they, for a while, thought they might be being sent to the mainland to be incarcerated, but they were, lo and behold, sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, to complete their basic training, which they did for about over a year of basic training before they were sent to Italy. And based on their good record fighting in Italy, the 4C order was rescinded and the 442nd was allowed to be formed, which was initially made up mostly of volunteers from the territory of Hawaii. So I think they had over 10,000 volunteers from a quota of like 1,500. So it was overwhelming enthusiasm to serve from Hawaii. They felt like it was part of their effort, but part of their enthusiasm is due to the part that there were no Japanese Americans in Hawaii that were incarcerated, such as on the mainland. So on the mainland, they did have a good amount that enlisted, volunteered, or kind of accepted their draft orders and literally enlisted or volunteered or enlisted out of incarceration camps, such as Manzanar, Poston, Minidoka, etc., and left their families behind behind barbed wire to go liberate Europe, as was kind of the popular narrative at that time. So that's really the really important context of how the 100th, 442nd, and MIS were all formed.
And can you kind of comment a little bit just on the different viewpoints, I guess? Obviously, for Hawaiian Japanese who were not incarcerated, there was, as you kind of suggested, this impetus to get enlisted. What were maybe some of the ideas in terms of the political ambition, or simply just the positionality? Like, why did these folks want to serve in the military?
Definitely, that's a great point as well. The Japanese Americans in Hawaii, they felt like they were not incarcerated, but they definitely had a glass ceiling. They felt like the glass ceiling was going to be a plantation worker working on the sugar, pineapple plantations, or maybe at best becoming a secondary school teacher. There were no aspirations for any Senator Daniel Inouye's at that time or anything like that. So they thought if they went and joined the war effort, and then they weren't thinking maybe this far ahead, but using the GI Bill to get an education, that was their way to become not just plantation workers, but to become politicians and business leaders in the state of Hawaii and beyond that. So that's how you lead to, Senator Daniel Inouye's and really notable public figures that come from Hawaii from the Nisei generation.
Yeah, I mean, what I find interesting, I guess, in both the Japanese American and African American context, I mean, clearly these populations are fighting for freedoms that they were not experiencing currently. Obviously, extremely different compared to the Jim Crow South and the reality that most African Americans faced in the Deep South. But there's still this fundamental civil rights issue, I think, for both of them, both communities, to really enlist in the military. Frank, when we were talking last week, we touched upon a couple of specific issues where, even beyond maybe some of the administrative challenges or the idea that, these were for show, these original segregated troop regiments, that once folks did begin entering combat situations, there's unequal treatment there. You kind of mentioned the high casualty rate. But one of the other things that you mentioned that was interesting was the Freeman Field Officers Club. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that incident.
Yes. Now, this was a group of Tuskegee Airmen that were training to be bombers. This unit was supposed to serve over in the Pacific. Some of them had already served over in Europe and come back, had volunteered to fight in Japan as well, or fight in the Pacific as well. And so they were being trained as bombardiers and bomber pilots, navigators, all that sort of thing. Now, the 477th Bomber Group, they were originally training in Selfridge Field in outside Detroit, Michigan. Now, the commanding officer there, they were under the 1st Air Force. The commanding officer there was a segregationist from Georgia, Franco D. Hunter. When they tried to integrate the club there at Selfridge Field, and bear in mind these men were officers, so they should have been able to go to any officers club that any other officer could be. They were told that they could not enter. They tried repeatedly to, go in small groups to try to desegregate the club, and eventually the commanding officer there shut down the club. Now, originally they thought, this was somewhat of a victory. We can't go, but they can't go either. But then Franco D. Hunter visited them, called all the African-American officers together, and basically told them, you colored boys have come a long way, but you haven't come far enough. And if I can't handle you here, I know where they can handle you. And so he sent them behind what they call the Cotton Curtain, sent them down to Walterboro, South Carolina. There was an Army Air Force base there. And from there, they were split up into two groups. One group went to Godman Field in Kentucky near Fort Knox, and the other group went to Anterbury Air Force Base in Indiana. Now, both of these bases were inadequate for the training they were doing. They were training to operate B-25 bombers, and you need a certain length of runway and certain facilities. Neither one of these places had it, so eventually they were sent to Freeman Field in Indiana. When they got to Freeman Field, the commanding officer there was Colonel Robert Selway. Colonel Selway was also a segregationist, unfortunately for them. And and when they tried to integrate the officers club there, they went in groups of 2 or 3 at a time. Were told that they couldn't enter. And so what he did, he thought he was coming up with a way to get past the new Army regulations that you couldn't have segregated facilities for officers. So he set up 2 officers clubs. He designated one for the trainees, that was Officers Club 1, and Officers Club 2 was for the regular officers. Now, Officers Club 1 was a rundown, dilapidated building. The Tuskegee Airmen that were trained there called it Uncle Tom's Cabin. So they pretty much ignored that Officers Club and kept trying to integrate the real Officers Club, Officers Club 2. Eventually, 61 of them were arrested, but they found they didn't have enough grounds to prosecute, so they were eventually released. And what he did was set the policy in writing that you would basically agree to segregate yourselves, not try to integrate any of these facilities, whether it was the officers club or the movie theater or any of the other facilities. And 101 of them refused to sign the order. Now, this was a direct order, and in the time of war, if a superior officer gives you a direct order, you can be arrested and you can possibly be killed. They were arrested, and he sent them back to Godman Air Force Base and to a prison facility. So here they were being guarded by white MPs with rifles and large dogs. They were able to get word out to the black press. And once it got into the black press, it spread from there into the regular press, and they got pressure from politicians. And eventually they set a group of colonels to investigate the situation. And they called Benjamin O. Davis Jr. back from, who was the commander of the 332nd. They called him back from Europe and to take control of the situation. And eventually charges were dismissed against all but 3 of the men. And they were tried for court-martial. 2 were found innocent, and they found the 3rd man guilty, but not for trying to integrate the club, but they claimed that he had jostled a superior officer in trying to enter the club. So he suffered a removal of rank, a fine, and he was dishonorably discharged. And in fact, the records of the Freeman Field mutineers was not cleared until President Clinton. in the 90s. So this is something that stayed on the record for quite a while. So this was basically one of the first nonviolent, almost a sit down or sit-in type action on American soil in terms of the civil rights movement. Now, some of these men, by the way, one of the organizers of this movement was the future mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young. He was a lieutenant for the 477 Bomber Group.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, to think about the reality that, here are these folks who are about to go overseas and put their lives in jeopardy, and they're still being subjected to the same prejudicial treatment that plagued so much of the country at that time period. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit more about the civil rights movement a bit further in that conversation.
Oh, and by the way, while they were in custody at Gavin Field, at that same place there were German POWs who had complete freedom of movement. They could, go to Fort Knox, they could go into town, they could do all the things that these Americans could not do. And they had fought for their country. So that was one of the things that enraged these men, I think, the most. Is that here we are, we've fought, some of us have died. And
yeah,
the enemy can do things we cannot do in our own country.
Absolutely. And it's a stark contrast for sure. Gavin, I want to turn the conversation back towards some of the Japanese American experiences in the military before they went overseas. I know we were talking a little bit about the time that they had spent at Camp Shelby in the Jim Crow South, and having to navigate the idea of segregation for the first time in a very strict legal sense, right? I mean, there's certainly this idea of places that you wouldn't go perhaps within a mainstream white society as a Japanese American, but certainly not the same experience by any means as the way that it was dogmatized. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like for some of the folks who were navigating that time that they spent in the Jim Crow South.
Definitely. So like I stated, the vast majority of the Japanese Americans who served in the 100th and 442nd were either from Hawaii or the Western coast, such as California, Oregon, Washington, where, systemic segregation and Jim Crow laws did not exist. So when they finally, after they, have gone through their discrimination of either incarceration or being kind of sailed away from Hawaii, they arrive in Camp Shelby, which is in Mississippi, which is obviously Mississippi does not at that time did not have a lot of experience with Asian Americans. So these Japanese Americans are met with Jim Crow laws and are instantly confused by the notion of separate facilities for Black people and white people. So and they, beyond being shocked by that notion, they are then having to figure out where they fit in that dichotomy of Black and white as being Asian Americans. So I think a lot of them, when they finally did get answers, the officers in the military and around town, the town of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, told them that they were to use white facilities and as they were traveling around the South, which was confusing for them. They didn't consider themselves white. In fact, a lot of the soldiers from Hawaii resented that labeling, because to them that meant that was a plantation owner type mentality, or the oppressor mentality, which is why the Hawaiian and mainland Japanese Americans even didn't get along at first, because they thought the mainland Japanese Americans were stuck up or white, like because of the way they spoke English and not having pidgin. But that was a big kind of reflection moment for them, and a lot of them found that they identified more with the Black community there, just because of their shared experiences of discrimination and racism. And in fact, there are even stories coming from some veterans who were in Camp Shelby that they hated Army food and rations so much that they would sneak out and eat either with Black troops, or they would go into town, into Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and eat, Southern soul food, which a lot of them brought that love of, the soul food and Southern food back with them to California, and they kind of tried to have it any chance they could. So there was definitely that wake up moment, even going through basic training, and that's how they kind of identified and tried to come to grips with that Jim Crow laws, which really, confused them even more than they were already confused heading to the mainland.
Yeah, so then I think one of the other things that I think is really unique about the Japanese American experience, we think a little bit about the intense animosity towards Japan and the anti-Japanese propaganda that existed at that time period. We know obviously that it resulted in a lot of anti-Japanese sentiments in the United States. And I would imagine that among the soldiers themselves, that this was probably some of the strongest feelings. Given the availability of the war films that were being produced by the Office of War Information. One of the films actually that we had included in the clip reel was a film called Japanese Americans. And then it talks a little bit about the service in the European front and the bloody battles of Anzio and the Italian campaign, with an extremely high casualty rate. That's sort of where the 400th Battalion and later the 442 first earns that nickname, the Purple Heart Battalion. But I think more than anything, the story of the Lost Battalion really kind of illustrates this idea that these Japanese American troops were in some ways viewed as expendable by some of the commanding officers. And I know General Dahlquist in particular gets a lot of flack for his kind of viewpoint on that. Wondering if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on that and just some of the experiences that they faced in combat arena.
Right. So the context of General Dahlquist and his relationship with his Japanese American troops in the 100th and 442nd is that there was a group, the 141st Regiment, one of their battalions got surrounded and trapped by German soldiers and had no escape route, had no way to relieve them to escape. And General Dahlquist was the officer in charge there, and he ordered the 100th and 442nd to go in and rescue these men at all costs, even though they had just finished up a long campaign fighting for Briere and Bifontaine. So in that way, some of the Japanese Americans felt like we had just gotten off the line and now you're throwing us to the wolves again to relieve this Texas battalion that's trapped. And they were losing 2, 3, and 4 men per one that they saved. The casualties were outrageous. So I think the subtext there is there are obviously differing opinions among the men who served them. Some were very adamant in saying that General Dahlquist saw them as expendable and that they could be sent on these dangerous missions without really regard for their safety. Others maybe were a little more moderate and thought that General Dahlquist maybe was just so aggressive and he hated his pride, could not take the idea of one of his battalions being trapped and made to look foolish by German soldiers. And others just thought that he had some error in strategy, which maybe there's all three of those things can come into play together. Obviously, there's no real definite answer, but you'd have to think that there is some bias in thinking because the 442nd was so effective, they had such a great record of their effectiveness in battles that in a way it made sense to send them, but at the cost of what they had to give up to rescue the Texas battalion, that is unsure of how effective a military strategy that ultimately was.
Yeah, thanks for that. And for folks who want to learn more about that particular battle, we have a film in the film festival called Rescuing the Lost Battalion that was produced by NHK. It has some dramatizations of various battle sequences, as well as first-person accounts from surviving veterans. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the post-war era now. And Frank, we had kind of mentioned in your earlier remarks how the Tuskegee Airmen were really sort of a catalyst to civil rights. And, you know, as you mentioned, the nonviolent coordinating that was done at Freeman Field and elsewhere, these are tactics that we'll see again in the post-war era.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit, when we spoke before, you mentioned that there were a couple of very prominent figures who were servicemen that ended up in the civil rights movement.
Yes. Roy Wilkins, trying to think of the person who was assassinated in front of his kids in Mississippi. It'll come to me. But also Dabney Montgomery, who was a Tuskegee Airman. He was from Selma, Montgomery. He came back to Selma. He had moved to New York. But once the civil rights movement started and the Selma Montgomery March was being planned, he moved back to Selma and became part of the movement. He, in fact, became Martin Luther King Jr.'s bodyguard during the march. Let me think. There was one of the attorneys who, for Malcolm X, and also was a freedom rider himself, was a Tuskegee Airman. He also had a number of veterans like Ralph Abernathy, though not a Tuskegee Airman, who was, of course, a prominent civil rights leader. Once they came back from what they had overcome overseas and saw how they were being treated even after what they had risked, I would say it gave them an incentive, a push to make conditions better. We had seen something similar to this try to be started after World War I, but there was such a pushback, and you had things like Red Summer and, of course, Tulsa, and what happened in Florida with the Rosewood incident. That eventually that was able to be clamped down to a certain extent, but it didn't go away, it just built. And after World War II, there were at first a number of lynchings of service people like there had been after World War I, but this time the reaction was different. I think it was more of we saw what had happened with our parents and grandparents, and we're not going to let this happen again. We've had enough, and this is going to change. So they weren't able to intimidate their way out of the problem this time. And also, I think tactics changed. You had the nonviolent movement started by Dr. King, and also at the same time, you had something people don't really talk about much, but there was a march on Washington that had been planned by the leader of the sleeping car porters, A. Philip Randolph, during World War II. He was pressuring President Roosevelt for more opportunities within the defense industry. And he had been talked out of proceeding with that movement, the March on Washington back in the 40s, by President Roosevelt signing an executive order banning discrimination in defense industries. But he also was one of the leaders of the March on Washington back in the 60s as well. So, you know, he had learned from what had happened, and some of the other leaders had learned from what had happened. And many of the foot soldiers of the movement, not just the leaders, but the foot soldiers were returning veterans, both from World War II and also from Korea. And my own family, my father was. He returned from fighting overseas, and when the treatment he received when he came back spurred him into joining the civil rights movement here as well. I know in Tuskegee they had tried a gerrymandering situation to cut out the black vote in the city of Tuskegee by getting rid of all the black people on the map in the city of Tuskegee. But they were able to use legal means, a suit against the mayor at the time, to get that overturned.
It's pretty remarkable, you know, just kind of reflecting on the intensity of the anti-Black sentiment that people still faced when they returned from this conflict. And, you know, when we kind of pause to think about the idea that so many of these soldiers probably served in a way to sort of prove that they were worthy of this, you know, equal treatment, and
absolutely
wanting to see a better society for them and their countrymen. And it's also incredible to think the kind of courage that their service gave to other people in the African-American community, beyond even the service population. You know, I think turning towards the idea of some of the films that we had shown in this program, Wings for This Man, you know, really produced by the Office of War Information, it is essentially a propaganda film that is just kind of meant to show that, you know, hey, we have African-American pilots and we treat them fairly. And just, you know, listening to some of the stories that you've told, right? I think it's a very, very different, I think, reality, not just after the war, but even during the war for these individuals.
Yeah, it was definitely different. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen, they did luck out eventually in having, at least in Tuskegee, Colonel Noah Parrish was progressive Kentuckian, who one of the first things he did was remove all the segregated signs, the signs saying white only here or black here, and all that kind of thing. He removed all those signs. Now, his predecessor had rigidly enforced segregation, and it, of course, had severely damaged morale. But Noel Parrish actually believed in, you know, the Tuskegee Airmen project. He wanted it to succeed, and he treated the men fairly and as individuals. Now, as I talked about earlier, you didn't get that with the 477th in Suffrage Field and Freeman Field. And there were some issues in the tank battalions. Now, Colonel Bates was a fair man, and he tried to treat his men fairly. But some of the other tank units, like the 758th, had issues. For one thing, probably the most famous member of the 761st did not actually serve overseas. That was Jackie Robinson, the Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. I think there was a dramatization of it some years ago, but I don't know that it's very well known, that he, on a bus from Camp Hood in Texas to town, he refused to go to the back of the bus. And he was arrested and threatened with court-martial. Now, Colonel Bates refused to sign the court-martial orders. He liked Jackie Robinson, liked his character, and liked him as an officer. In fact, he had named him morale officer because of his rapport with the men. But the higher-ups above Colonel Bates transferred Jackie Robinson to another unit, the 758th, and the commander there signed the court-martial papers. And after about a 17-day or so trial, he was found not guilty, but he left the military soon after. In a sense, it might have been fortunate, since if he had, considering how many deaths they were with the 761st incident, with the 761st unit rather, 761st Battalion, if he had gone over there and not survived, it would have, of course, changed history.
Mm-hmm.
We would have taken Jackie Robinson's place in desegregating baseball. So,
Absolutely.
and it's happened for a reason.
yeah, absolutely. And again, it just shows how many stories there are of really striking individuals who not only served their country, but were able to kind of leverage that to have more civil rights at home. And, I think again, thinking about some of the propaganda, the films related to the Japanese Americans, at least related to the Lost Battalion incident, and some of the newsreels that kind of celebrate that, all honors due, obviously, but also thinking about how that did result in a more favorable return for Japanese Americans. I often wonder, had the 442 been less successful in their campaigns, would Japanese Americans been able to peacefully resettle in the way that many did after the incarceration camps closed? And I think, Senator Dan Inoue, who Gavin, you mentioned a little bit earlier, I think his whole political career really, I think, rested on the service. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, I guess, what the impact of that kind of propagandized story of the 442, whether you see that as having had a significant impact on political careers or other successes.
It's a complicated question, but I think it ultimately does. When we interviewed veterans and tried to understand their reasoning behind why they served, a really common theme was that they wanted to prove their loyalty, or in some cases say they wanted it on record that Japanese Americans, when they were called upon in a time of distress for themselves, stepped up and served their country when it would have made almost a lot of sense not to do so because of the way they were treated. So in a way, they knew that there would be casualties. They knew that some would not come back, but in kind of paraphrasing them, they were willing to pay that blood tax. They were willing to make those contributions on record so that their children and grandchildren could have brighter futures. Tying it back to Senator Inoue, he had aspirations to become a physician when he came back from the war, but he obviously lost his arm in Italy and then decided to pivot to politics. But just to highlight just to give an idea of the discrimination he even faced on his way back, he was on the mainland, he came in, walked into a barber shop, had only one arm, was in his military uniform, and was trying to get a haircut, and the owner of the barbershop looked at him and said, we're not going to cut your hair, and threw a nice slur in there for him, for Japanese Americans, for good measure, even though he's sitting there with one arm, medals pinned to his chest, in his American Army uniform. So it was, even though the films and the propaganda helped make some headway in changing maybe other veterans' minds, knowing that what this unit did, they were the most decorated unit in American military history, there was still tough sledding. Japanese Americans had a hard time purchasing homes after the war, still due to lingering anti-Japanese sentiment. So it really just highlights how such a rise from a senior, Hawaii having a senator like Senator Inoue is such a amazing achievement that he was able to work his way up and then break that glass ceiling and really prove that Japanese Americans for his generation and generations to come would have no such limitations to becoming leaders and not in just Hawaii, but all over the United States, which is where I think they would say they can pursue any opportunity they want, which is really what their goal was when they served. They had that kind of foresight to say, we want to serve to make sure that our generations to come in this country will know that we are loyal American citizens and can do anything we set our mind to.
Thanks for that, Gavin. And we have an audience question that you can help us out with as well. Thomas Kurihara writes, I've read somewhere that more Japanese Americans attended the language school, not segregated. Was the MIS segregated in the strict definition?
Yes and no. There were Caucasian officers in the military intelligence service. Kai Rasmussen is the one that comes to mind, who was an officer there that kind of headed up the whole unit outside of John Iso. But it was segregated in that pretty much everyone that attended the language school at either Camp Savage or Fort Snelling was Japanese American. But when the linguists were sent out on assignment, they were put into small groups or teams and then attached to non-segregated units, such as Navy units, intelligence units, or Marine units, or even working for the Office of War Information and things like that, producing propaganda. So they were set out in small teams, non-segregated units for the most part.
Thanks for that. And then I have a follow-up question from Thomas for maybe all of us. How many segregated infantry divisions in addition to the airmen and tank battalions?
Well, most of the segregated units were service units for African Americans. There were of course, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd. There were 3 segregated tank battalions, the Red Ball Express. There was a segregated battalion of WACs who handled the Victory Mail in England. There was warehouses full of mail that hadn't been sorted through, and the 868s took care of that job, which of course helped with morale. By the way, I finally remembered the name of the soldier I was trying to remember. McGavin was a World War II veteran and noted civil rights leader in the state of Mississippi. You also, of course, had the quartermasters who delivered supplies to all the various units. So I don't have an exact number, but most of the units would have been service units, except for like the airmen and the tank battalions. And, you did have an engineer unit who worked in Alaska and Canada to build the highway through there. A lot of the people on that job, of course, were African American. But one of the things that happened is that though they faced segregation from Americans when they weren't, say, at the front, I know with the 761st Battalion and also for the Tuskegee Airmen, once they got into action and their fellow soldiers, the white soldiers, saw how good they were, they wanted to come home alive. So some of those barriers, at least in terms of being at the front, kind of fell away to a certain extent. For example, the 761st was an independent battalion, so it was attached to various divisions of the infantry under the command of General Patton. And so many of the infantry officers and infantrymen were Caucasian. But of course, they were the tank battalion, and since they were one of the best tank battalions, they kept being requested. In a similar way, the Tuskegee Airmen, since they were so good at detecting the bombers, Of course, the bomber crews were over there were white, but they wanted the best, and Tuskegee Airmen had a lower rate of bombers that had been shot down. About half the number of bombers were shot down, with the Tuskegee Airmen protecting you as other groups over there at the same time. So if you want to live, you kind of overlook a few things.
And that's an important distinction to make, right? Because I think you know, when we think about it, it's one thing to be segregated in a training camp. It's another thing you're shoulder to shoulder in a foxhole somewhere. I mean, your brothers in arms. It doesn't matter what color they are, right? And one would imagine that that even helped to eradicate some of the prejudice that some of the white soldiers from more conservative backgrounds may have held before the war.
I would think, hopefully. I know at my job, I've met a few visitors who said that, you know, a Tuskegee Airman saved my grandfather, for example. You know, or my grandfather would not have survived the war if it wasn't for, you know, the red tail.
Yeah.
So you hear stories like that, but
Yeah.
now, away from the front, when they went to, when they first got to Europe, for example, the civilians and regular people in the case of the 761st, England and France, treated them very well. They treated, you know, as allies, trusted allies, comrades, which made the Americans that had already, the white Americans that had already been over there angry. And they tried to tell the French and the English all types of racist myths about African Americans, that we were rapists of women and children, and we had tails and all that kind of ridiculous thing. And some of the things happened for the Tuskegee Airmen, at least until they got into the actual fight. But they were treated well by the civilians, but the people of the country that they had gone to, they saw them as liberated. They were just happy to be freed from under the yoke of Hitler, basically. They didn't care what color you were, you saved me, you know. And as I stated earlier in our earlier conversation, the incoming Secretary of State, his stepfather had been saved by the 761st. And the 761st, when they came into Austria, they talked about being in the woods and seeing this fence when they knocked the fence down and went on in, and being just shocked by what they saw, you know, smells to death, survivors looking like, you know, walking skeletons, basically. And that, of course, is something you carry with you for the rest of your life. You're never gonna be able to forget something like that.
Yeah.
But the people they saved, of course, they didn't care that they were African American or black. They would just saw them as their saviors, as their, you know, liberators.
Absolutely. And, you know, I know that there's a kind of similar narrative around the 442nd in the time that they spent in France. And during the Champagne campaign, I think a lot of the locals did kind of shower them with praise. And I know that there's certain groups that have even returned to Europe for many years to visit the sites that they liberated. So Gavin, I'm wondering if you might be able to kind of expand on that a little bit. Also, you know, one of the things that you touched on in the end there, Frank, is the idea that, you know, some of these folks were also involved in the liberation of Dachau. And, you know, the 552nd Artillery Unit that was part of the 442 was part of that same force that helped to liberate Dachau. So it's kind of interesting parallels, but Gavin, wondering if you could kind of comment on some of that.
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah. So the 442nd's experience in France still is relevant today to especially the people of Briere. It's a town in it's a village in France, really, and they vowed at the time after the 442nd liberated them that they would never forget. And even up to this past year, in 2019, as they were able, there are reunion tours that go to Briere, and the townspeople who are two or three generations removed from World War II still have parades and welcome any Japanese Americans, descendants of the 442nd veterans or descendants of the 442nd that come to this town. And there was a veteran named Lawson Sakai who we lost earlier this year, but his last trip in 2019, he was the only 442nd veteran that was able to come. But they still wrote him. The groups there, they collect military Jeeps and vehicles and, retrograde them and, like custom fit them to look like they would have done in 1945. And they, march around town and kind of they call them parade their liberators and thank them 75 plus years later. And that's a tradition I think will continue. But to also talk about Dachau, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion was the artillery battalion of the 442nd, like you said. And during April of 1940, or the spring of 1945, they were split off and they came upon a satellite camp of Dachau and were very confused as to what they were coming upon. They ran off the little German resistance that were there, and as they put it, they came upon these what they thought were bodies or corpses that were skeletons, even because they were so frail, but they were actually survivors of the Holocaust and that were still in Dachau. And they said, and there are accounts of veterans that say of some of their fellow soldiers went into the camp and could barely stomach what they saw, with the devastation and the horror of what they witnessed. And a lot of them, when we interviewed them years later, kind of reflected on how sad, odd, strange, or ironic it was that they who were either second-class citizens in Hawaii or incarcerated on the mainland would be liberators to concentration camp death camps survivors when their families were in concentration camps in the US in a lot of ways. Right. So there's that shared connection, and a lot of them maintain relationships with the people, the individuals that they saved, even until decades later on in life.
Yeah, and those kinds of stories, I think, are really the things that get lost a little bit. Certainly, in any of the photos of the liberation of Dachau, you don't see the African Americans or the Japanese Americans that were involved. There was a Netflix series that came out recently, The Liberator, that kind of going back to this earlier question about other segregated troops, not quite as strictly as the African American troops, but there was a group of Southwestern volunteers who came from Mexican American and Native American backgrounds that were organized in a particular troop regiment that's explored in this series, The Liberator. So it kind of gives you an idea that similar narratives exist, whether or not they're well known. And then the other interesting thing about that group was that they also participated in the liberation of Dachau. So all of these kinds of groups sort of converging on, obviously, the most extreme of oppressions that the Jewish community faced with the Holocaust. Very, by comparison, Japanese American concentration camps are very, very different, right? And kind of making that distinction as well. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but we had another question from the audience related to this injustice that Japanese Americans were facing, because obviously, as many Japanese Americans volunteered for the military, there were also individuals who protested that, who either refused to sign the loyalty questionnaire, or folks who outright resisted the draft. And I'm curious, either Gavin or myself, we could kind of explore this a little bit further, but Do you know of any specific instances in the military where Japanese Americans who were enlisted did some kind of protest?
Yes, definitely. The most notable name that comes to mind for an individual is Cedric Shimo. He was enlisted and he was, ready to serve his country, but he could not really reconcile the fact that he was being told to serve his country while his family and other Japanese Americans were behind barbed wire. So he protested while he was enlisted and was about to go to the military intelligence service, but he was denied furlough to visit his mother at Manzanar, which was kind of the last straw for him. He then resisted and protested the treatment, the injustice, and the racism, and he was kind of relegated to the 1800 Engineer Battalion, I believe it's called, which was a unit that was really for people who the military considered suspect, either Italian or German background that were considered suspect or suspicious peoples, which Cedric was not. He just was protesting. And Cedric was given an honorable discharge, but a lot of the time the veteran or the soldiers that were protesting were threatened with dishonorable discharge, and a lot of them had to fight dishonorable discharges later on in their life because it affected their job prospects and their record and things like that, or qualifying for benefits. So there were protests of Japanese Americans in the military and they had to face those consequences, and they showed that courage or that conviction in a different way, but still admirable way, kind of like the veterans did fighting on the battlefield.
Yeah. I know we have another film in the festival online that kind of explores the idea of conscientious objectors, the good war and those who refuse to fight it. So although they don't talk about the Nikkei draft resistors, they certainly cover a lot of that other population. So I have another audience question from Kurt Ikeda for both of you. Would love to hear more about the women of color in the military. I'm wondering if either of you could speak to any experiences.
Just quickly, I can just say that Japanese American women did enlist and were a part of the Women's Army Corps. They enlisted almost as slightly after the 4C order was lifted alongside their male counterparts, and they were willing and ready to do whatever duty required of them, but they ultimately mostly ended up doing administrative and clerical work for the military intelligence service. That's how they were assigned out, and a small group of them did go to Japan after the war and serve and help during the occupation as administrative help to General MacArthur in the GHQ in Tokyo.
You had a number of African-American nurses. Tuskegee Army Airfield had a full complement of nurses. You also had African-American women who served as mechanics. They weren't in the military. But Moulton Field, where they did the primary flight training, and that's where Tuskegee Army Airfield and the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site is. You had civilian women who worked there. You had civilian women who worked as clerks, who worked as mechanics, who worked as parachute riggers, who worked security guards, who worked as radio operators. For the most part, the women, the African-American women who did serve overseas, some of them were nurses, and some of them, as I said, belonged to the male unit in Britain. But on another matter, the concentration camp that the 761st freed was in Austria. It was Gunskirchen. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that.
It was a small sub camp. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I wanted to just kind of, before we kind of close out, being that we're kind of having this conversation in the context of a film festival, wanted to hear if you had any reactions or reflections on either the propaganda films that we had shown. I don't know if you had seen these all before. In the clip reel, we had Wings for This Man, Negro Colleges in Time of War, Japanese Americans, The Lost Battalion, and several newsreel clips related to the 442's return from overseas and being awarded the Medal of Honor from President Truman. So just kind of curious and opening it up to either of you if you had any thoughts or reactions to those films.
I would say it was typical of the time. I mean, you were trying to help in the war effort to get people to volunteer and to help win the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. So, I mean, it was what you would expect from the time. Now, some of the Hollywood films, like Red Tails and the Tuskegee Airmen, the HBO movie, especially the HBO one, was very historically inaccurate. The Red Tails got a lot of things wrong as well, but it kind of gave you a flavor. But I would say that both of them have, in terms of Red Tails, they changed all of the names, for example. None of the original names were used. The battles, the way they did the battles, of course, was quite wrong. But it gives you a flavor of what some of the treatment that they received and why they were needed. But if you really want to know, you got to watch a documentary.
I would echo Frank's sentiments a lot. And when it comes to Japanese Americans, obviously the propaganda was kind of twofold. It was marketed as a way to hopefully decrease all the anti-Japanese sentiment that was building, because they realized that it would be such bad PR if these veterans coming back would be subject to all that anti-Japanese sentiment. But also the classic propaganda purpose of making the war not seem so gruesome to families back home. But so I think that's partly why when you reflect on it in documentaries and such, those are the chances you have to see about the difficulties and the trauma that a lot of the Japanese American soldiers were going through. And I think slowly, as the representation starts to increase a little bit, people are learning about the hardships in the context more and more. So it's not exactly the Van Johnson-led Go for Broke, which is the eyes through a Caucasian narrator, but it's more NHK, more in-depth documentaries, or the Go for Broke movie, which is by Stacey Hayashi, and things like that are more in-depth and more reflective of the representation of the actual experience. So that's all I think the veterans are hoping for, is that accurate representation of their contributions, but also what they sacrificed to make it all happen.
Yeah, and I think it does really have an impact on the way that I think both of these groups are remembered, because unfortunately for those people who don't have the opportunity to either interact with the veterans themselves or haven't seen other documentary films with those perspectives, it's very difficult, I think, for these hardships to kind of come through in the dominant historical narrative. You hear about the sacrifice and the valor, but you don't necessarily hear about the necessity for the double victory, right?
Right.
And hopefully through conversations like these, we can kind of start to unwind the complicated legacy, and certainly it's one that's worth understanding, and especially as we have conversations now in our society. But I just wanted to thank you both for joining us for this conversation this evening. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our viewers did at home. Before we sign off, I also just wanted to plug the next program that's coming up at 9 p.m. Eastern, E Olakoa, Sharing Stories of Hawaiian Warriors. Another great discussion program on this. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you again to our guests, and we look forward to seeing you on some more of the programs throughout this weekend.